So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first in our latest series of what I jokingly call lockdown lectures, but not so jokingly, really. And this evening, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Alexa Frost. And Alexa is one of my colleagues, and she is the archivist at Blenheim Palace. And so this evening, we're going to ask the archivist. So, Alexa, welcome.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. And the first thing I'd like to ask you really is to learn a little bit more about you. How long have you actually been working as the archivist at Blenheim Palace?
So I've been working in the archives since 2014. I started working doing freelance project relating to cataloguing and getting it into an electronic database, and then a year later I started working permanently in the archives, and it grew from there.
Oh, lovely. And is it something you've always had an interest in doing? When you were a little girl, did you know, when people said, what do you want to be when you grow up, did you say, I'd like to be an archivist at Blenheim Palace?
No. In words. However, I did do a survey at school, at secondary school, and it came out with that I should be a librarian. So maybe there was a bit of that. I come from an academic background, so my experience of archives, to be honest, was from a researcher's point of view. So to get to the opportunity of being the custodian of the papers and enabling researchers was seeing things from a completely different side, and very exciting from that point of view.
And Alexa, you've seen a few changes, I think, since you started.
Yeah.
I mean, where are you sitting at the moment?
Virtually. So I'm virtually sitting in the new archives. We moved here in 2017. Powers of modern technology mean that I can work from home in the archives, so to speak.
Lovely. So when you started, I mean, can you tell me a little bit about the history of the archives at Blenheim? So what was the first kind of, are you the first archivist? Has there been someone there for 300 years? What's been going on?
Okay, so quite surprisingly, I'm actually the first qualified archivist in the 300-year history of the palace. Right. And it's the first formal post that there has been in place. My predecessor was a retired education manager, and he volunteered and helped set things up and get them running. And I worked closely with him to move things forwards. And prior to that, there hadn't been an enormous amount of formal activity going on. For those of you that have visited the palace and are aware of it, there have been moves over time. Most recently, there was a move from what is now the Orangery area and the campaign rooms where people can have lectures and conferences. They moved from there into the palace, and then now to a different part of the palace. Taking a step back before then, the 8th Duke appointed a gentleman called Stuart Reed.
Now, I have a slide here, Alexa, which is relevant to that. There you go.
Point. Yeah. So Stuart Reed was the son of a reverend from Newcastle, and he was known for being a reviewer and writer and publisher. And we're not entirely clear how he became closely connected to the 8th Duke and began working for him. But in 1896 to 1900, he had helped the 8th Duke create a historical library to replace the Sunderland Library. Right. During this time, the information that we've got here in 1889, Stuart Reed was the first person to write a report. The document that we're looking at here is the Report and Classification of Blenheim Archives, and it spans 2 volumes. Oh. And I think what's particularly warming and exciting for me, reading the introduction in particular, is that I can really relate to Reed's experience of finding the archives. At this point, they're actually in the library, and he writes in October 1890, was when he first started the work in the October. He writes, I found parchments, state papers, military reports, private letters, maps, plans, and a number of manuscripts volumes deposited in a haphazard fashion in the presses of the Long Library in bundles large and small, and the utmost confusion prevailed among the papers. And this brings a great smile to my face, because that reminds me very much of the state of the archives of parts of it that I took on many
shall I pop the slide up of what it was like?
Yes.
Hold on. Let's see if we can get it to move. Oh, dear me. Okay, technology is wonderful when it works. There you go.
There we go. So this is a picture of the archives in January 2016. It used to be in the Undercroft, which is in the basements of the palace. And if you look around, you can see why I can identify with Reed's comments. He writes, the whole collection has more or less suffered from neglect, and the ravages of mildew of mice are only too perceivable. Though I'm happy to be able to add that in the majority of cases, the most important papers, in the historical sense of the term, are still practically unharmed. So what we can see here is the boxes that are in a buff colour to date are largely still uncatalogued, because there's a staggering volume of them. This is less than a quarter of the material that we had at this point.
Right.
And I think the concern with those boxes that we see that are buff coloured is when you open them, not only are they very old, they've been untouched for so many years, but also they have got rusty brass paper clips on some of the documents, and rusty staples, which are going to cause a problem. So what we'll do is we'll move them out of there, which we'll discuss in a minute. But in terms of the progression for the archives as a location, this is where we were at in 2016, and in 2017 we moved. I think we've got a picture there.
There we go.
So whereas in the basement the conditions were becoming increasingly undesirable, we were beginning to get patches of mould and damp that we had to keep a constant eye on. I'm now spoilt with 3 rooms of storage area, and last summer, 2019 summer, sorry, I gained a separate office which allows easier access for visitors. So now we have got rolling racks. They are metal as opposed to wood, which means that the items are much better protected, and in an environment where the conditions are more stable. This is above ground, so we don't have the same problem of damp and humidity that we had previously.
Alexa, can I just stop you there? So you mentioned that you've now got an office that you can work from separate from this, because it always used to strike me whenever I came down to look in the archives, that I would have to wear 5-6 layers of clothing, because of course you now have the wherewithal to what temperature do you have to keep things at?
Well, we need to keep it at an average of about 17 to 18 all year round, and we don't need it can't go lower than 13 or higher than 22, which seems quite a good range. But if you think of the fact that we're in an old building, and there are lots of windows, it's a matter of blocking the light, making sure there's sufficient airflow, but windows being closed, and making sure that it doesn't get too hot. We do have to have heating as well, because otherwise the walls are so thick, then it's going to get far too cold for the material. So it's balancing a little bit of radiator, but not too much.
Yeah.
But yes, it used to be very cold in the Undercroft. We'd have to wear lots of jumpers, and then when we were in this in this room here, it was equally cold. The condition of coming to research was bring an extra jumper, wasn't it?
Well, it certainly was. It certainly was. So sorry about that. One of the other things that struck me about when you were moving from the Undercroft to where you are now,
Yeah.
what did it physically entail? Because it was a huge job, wasn't it?
Unbelievably so. So it was a matter of taking items from the basement, the undercroft of the palace, across the courtyard into the new area. And it was a matter of making sure that items were wrapped so that they wouldn't get damaged. We did this in February, so fortunately there wasn't a downpour of rain or snow, but it was very cold, and Oxfordshire weather, like the rest of the UK, isn't entirely favourable when you're trying to move, very, very old documents. And it was transporting them across as safely and efficiently as possible to keep everything in the order that they were previously.
Right.
Whereas in a library you'll find items in alphabetical or category order. Where archives differ is you will keep them in the order in which you receive the material. So it really mattered if the wrong collection was brought at the wrong time. So it was a military operation, and I was very well supported to get it all done.
So that's interesting, because I'd always stupidly assumed that things were in chronological order. So in terms of date of origin, but in fact it's the date they received into the archive. Oh, that's interesting. Wow.
Which is why it is all the more important to keep on top of knowing what you actually have.
Yeah.
Because it's not as easy as going through the alphabet or going through a particular.
No, of course not. So let me ask you another question. So we've looked at the archives as they were. We've got a photograph here of the archives as they are now.
Yeah.
And then the next image. Tell me what's on here.
Yeah, so where it says old and new, what we're looking at is how things were stored and how things are stored now. Now, on the one hand, on the old side, there's a story behind these boxes, and these beautiful Victorian boxes. They look ever so pretty, and the scrolling of the writing, and they were actually put together by Stuart Reed, the gentleman who did the classification. And the initial plan when he was sorting through all of the papers was to have everything bound in volumes.
Right.
But he wasn't experienced, he didn't really know what to do, and the Duke wanted advice, so they called in experts from the Bodleian. And Oxford University recommended that they shouldn't have all of the papers bound because it was vastly expensive. But also some of the papers had been folded over, and if you there were two indelible fold marks, and items were fragile, and it was actually going to cause more damage to have them all flattened out and bound. So instead they decided to purchase bespoke cabinets and boxes, which we've got on the old on the left hand side. And they were made by a gentleman in Banbury. And Stuart Reed claims that he had designed them himself. And now if you look here, these where it's saying H1, for example, rolls and parchments of Sunderland papers, that's how he would organise them. And at the time, it was a vast improvement from being stuffed in parcels in the corner of the library. But of course, when I received them so many years later, you can see the problem with the boxes. If you're looking at the top, there's sort of white and speckle. That's evidence of water damage and damp over time. And so we moved them over to the admittedly less attractive, but boxes on the right hand side, which are made of acid-free cardboard and paper. They're fire resistant and water retardant. So they've got special properties by which you put the material into these boxes, and it's giving them the greatest chance of surviving longer without damage from the outside, but also the materials themselves not releasing chemicals that are going to destroy the papers inside them. And when I joined the department, I consulted the Bodleian and Oxford University staff myself, and they were suggesting these boxes. So I think it's a lovely story that's coming full circle from you inherit archives that aren't in perhaps the most desirable conditions as you would hope for, have the enthusiasm and the backing to be able to move forward and do something with it. And good old Bodleian and Oxford University have stepped in and helped us along the way in their 100 years differences.
So just to go back, so you mentioned that they're are they flame retardant? Or I mean, if I if I came along with a naked flame and placed it next to that little folder there, what would happen?
Well, I would ask you politely to leave the room very quickly. Yeah, so it's not going to burn as quickly as a standard folder that you would buy in a stationery shop. So it has an added layer of protection. But ultimately, if you held it close enough for long enough, then it would.
Excellent. Well, not excellent. I'm just going to stop there for a moment, because we've had a couple of questions, and we're going to save most of the queue with questions at the end. But I have one here from Dom, and it says, "What is the thing you are least willing to tell me is in the archives?" So, Dom, I think you'll need to elaborate a little bit on that. Or Alexa, do you understand?
I can't answer that, because I'm quite happy to be honest about what we have, but there's one item that if it ever went missing, I'd run quickly, because one of the oldest items that we have in the archives is called an incunabula, which are examples of first printed books before 1501. And there's a fantastic, interestingly, second edition of Virgil's Aeneid, which is dated in 1470. So that's something that I know is there, but it ever disappears as a classicist, that's my background prior to Blenheim, then that might like to look pretty on my bookcase rather than in the safety of the archives.
Can I just say that Dom has now piped up and said the Aeneid, wow, with several exclamation marks. So there's another question. I know it's something we were going to cover, and we were going to talk about who can access the archives. Now, I've got a question here from Duncan Graham, and he says, "I work as a guide at Blenheim, and having a degree in history and having studied the history of the first Duke of Marlborough and the family and estate, I would love to study some of the books in the Long Library about the life of the Duke of Marlborough, written in the 18th and 19th century. Would that be possible?"
That sounds a fantastic project, and I'd love to be involved in it. Unfortunately, the care of the library books doesn't fall under my actual remit. You would need to speak to the keeper of the collections and the palace. Now, because the library books are largely His Grace's and by the estate, it may not be possible to consult those documents. That being said, in the research that I've done over the years, going back to our friend Stuart Reed, in 1914, he wrote a book on the first Duke and Duchess, drawing information that he had the first access to to the Blenheim archives. That's something that has been scanned and reprinted, and you can get that on Amazon. And the other great resource for material is if you go to a website called Internet Archives. They have all sorts of out-of-print material that people have diligently scanned over the years, and that's available free. The other situation that we've got with the first Duke and Duchess's papers is a lot of them are no longer residing with us at Blenheim. They are actually were given as a gift to the nation in lieu of death duties when the 10th Duke died, and they went up to the British Library in the late 1970s. So they've got a fantastic collection of the first Duke's papers. So if you're interested in doing first-hand research, that's where I would recommend looking. Sorry, I'm not sure whether that really answered the question.
Well, no, I think it answered it beautifully, and I'm sure we'll be told if not. So, just going back a step then, Alexa, so who can access our archives?
So under ordinary circumstances, the archives aren't open to members of the public. So if you buy a ticket to come to Blenheim, that doesn't include the archives. You may be able to come and view material by appointment if you have contacted in advance with a specific academic research interest, or for example, you were writing a thesis or you were writing a paper for a local history group, that sort of thing. But if you were interested in a member of your family working at the estate, you wouldn't be able to consult the material for that. That would be something that I would carry out on your behalf. The problem, of course, at the moment with COVID-19 is the archives are completely closed and there's not access to any researchers, I'm afraid.
Yeah, but hopefully next year.
Yes. Looking forwards, yes.
Always looking forward.
Research interests, but it's not open to members of the public with their Palace and Garden tickets.
So, Alexa, how many items do you think there are? Ballpark figure, how many items have you got?
Okay, so this is the most obvious question to ask. I can tell you that there are over 10,000 items that are catalogued that I know that we have somewhere within the 3 rooms that we've got. But some of those catalogue entries will be an entire box worth. So they will be done at what we would call collection level. So we would have the name of a whole box. Within that box, there could be anything between 10 and 50 papers. Right. So I can tell you that I have 3 rooms, well over 10,000 items, but I couldn't hazard a guess, yes.
Okay, so Alexa, what's your favourite?
Right, well, I have a...
And this is completely unrehearsed. Completely unrehearsed.
So what I'd like to share with you today are some particularly attractive items that we've got. And the first one is a very beautiful and ornate book here, which was the addresses to the Duchess of Marlborough, the 7th Duchess, for her time when she was in Ireland. And
she didn't really expect to be in Ireland, did she, Alexa?
No, she didn't. It wasn't the original plan, was it?
No, it was again just to provide a little bit of background for people that are listening in. So the 7th Duke and Duchess of Marlborough were Winston Churchill's grandparents. They had 11 children, 5 boys, 6 girls. Of the 5 boys, 2 of them survived, and the oldest one was a bit of a lad, and he had an affair with a married woman called Edith Aylesford, and he was preparing to divorce his wife in order to take up with Edith. And Edith's husband wasn't terribly happy about this, and neither was his brother Randolph, Churchill's father. So in order to try and stop a family scandal, he went on to create a family scandal. And what he did, he came across some letters, some correspondence between the Prince of Wales, who later became Edward VII, and Edith, and he threatened to make these public. So he threatened the Prince of Wales, which was a huge mistake.
Yes, not wise.
Definitely not wise. And so they found themselves in a position where they weren't received in any respectable household. And so the seventh Duke was encouraged to go to Ireland as Viceroy, and Randolph ended up there as his unpaid secretary. And Winston spent, a couple of years out there when he was a little boy. So that just creates the perspective for that. But
Yes.
why did they present the Duchess with this beautiful, beautiful book?
So the Duchess was remarkable. Despite everything that was happening within the family, she was very pious herself and very committed to charitable causes. And whilst she was in Ireland, she dedicated herself and spent a lot of her time visiting and supporting schools, especially charity schools for poor girls. And she went to hospitals and orphanages and was aware of a variety of problems that were happening in Ireland at the time, and really wanted to make a difference and do something about it. And one of the things that she became aware of was that there was a decline in the Irish manufacturing industry, and she wanted Irish materials she promoted Irish materials amongst her circles to encourage the ladies of the days to buy silk and Irish lace and that sort of thing to keep people going. And the reason why she received this beautiful volume was in response to the potato famine and the failed potato crop in 1879. The Duchess wrote to the Times and created this idea of a famine fund, where she was encouraging all wealthy people in Ireland and in the UK, and requested support, especially for the poor people in Ireland who had been in Western Ireland, who were most affected.
Yeah.
So this fund was called the Irish Duchess Relief Fund, and the money was used to buy seed potato and food and fuel and clothing for impoverished people and children in particular. And the schools were given grants to provide meals of bread and potatoes and clothing as required. So this book was a collection of addresses that had been created by the children and by local church groups, illustrating their appreciation of the work that she had done. And you can see these gorgeous colours, and they're so rich and so beautiful, and the people were just so grateful because somebody was coming in and helping them at a time where they didn't have the same sort of charity fundraising schemes that we do today, and certainly not on such a scale. But just to put it into context, the Duchess raised £130,000 at the time, which today's money is £15.7 million.
Wow.
It's a staggering amount of money that really made a huge amount of difference to so many individuals and families that wouldn't have had the opportunity to rebuild their lives without it.
It's quite something, isn't it? My goodness.
Yeah.
It reminds me a bit of Captain Tom. So just to go on, Alexis, so tell me what this next slide is.
So, as I said, her hard work didn't go unnoticed, and this is actually a letter of personal thanks and commendation from Queen Victoria to the Duchess. And she writes from Windsor Castle in April the 19th, 1880. And it reads, "Dear Duchess, I, as everyone is, am filled with admiration of the indefatigable zeal and devotion with which you have successfully laboured to relieve the distress in Ireland. I am therefore anxious to mark my sense of your services at this moment when, alas, they will so soon be lost to Ireland, and wish to confer on you the 3rd class of the Victoria and Albert Order. I will wait till you come over to invest you with it. Believe me always, yours affectionately, Victoria R.I. And in this photograph here, we've got Duchess Frances very proudly reading the letter that we've just heard. But if you look very closely around her neck, she's actually wearing the 3rd class Victoria and Albert Order. And this was worn by the Queen on state occasions, and was actually the first time it had been conferred on anyone outside the royal family. So it was a huge commendation from the Queen to give the Duchess this beautiful item.
Excellent. Right, so Alexa, that's one of your favourite things. So what else are you particularly fond of? Because I can't believe there's only one series of things in that whole collection. So what else are you going to share with us this evening?
So, staying with the regal theme, I would like to move on to the accounts of Queen Anne, a account book that we've got here that covers the period of 1708 to 1711. And this was particularly exciting find for me. I wasn't aware that we had it. I stumbled across it.
Oh, wow.
And a very exciting find, because as you see, the picture on the left-hand side actually says the accounts for Queen Anne signed February the 1st, 1710 to 11, which were the law. That's actually written in Sarah's handwriting, which is, as we can see, quite difficult to read. But that was actually written on the back cover. The front cover, which is the same print, doesn't have anything written on it. And I was looking through it and scrolled through and got to the final page, which is on the right-hand side, where right at the bottom you can see Queen Anne's signature. And this find, it reminds me of another of Reed's comments in his book. He says that when he was looking through a parcel that named no importance inside it, when he opened it up, when he was going through the archives during the 8th Duke's time, it had old letters and household accounts and inventories, which he didn't think were of great importance. But he then also found the first military commission of John Churchill with Charles II's signature, and a parchment appointing Sarah, the Duchess of Marlborough, as mistress of the robes to Queen Anne.
Oh, wow.
So it just goes to show you can stumble across things when you are least expecting it. And this is an illustration of how Sarah, the first Duchess, was a meticulous bookkeeper, and she insisted that every last penny was accounted for. And this was quite revolutionary for the time, and it was the first real time the actual cost of running the court and country was being accurately recorded. And she also insisted that the Queen personally signed off the expenditure.
Gosh. And what can we see in here?
So this is very interesting. The first one at the top that we've got is an example of Sarah's payment, and this was when she was keeper of the privy purse, and she was paid every 6 months. So over the course of the year, she would be paid £2,000, which in today's money is around about £440,000. So that was an interesting insight to see it actually written down, and you can work out how much she was paid and the frequency with which she received it. Second item down is interesting because it shows a charitable side of the monarch, and it says given to the mad Spaniard.
How extraordinary.
Yeah, Who knows? And throughout the book, he receives a number of payments, actually, and to the value of around about £2,250 within about an 18-month period. But that's all we know. We know that he was mad. We know
How frustrating.
we know he received money, but I've yet to find a document that tells me who he was and why he got it.
And then there's a final one over on the right-hand side, Alexa. I don't know if you can make it out.
Yeah, so that says, given a jeweler on Thanksgiving Day, and that's the equivalent of £878. And that's actually referring to a Thanksgiving service at St Paul's Cathedral in honour of the first Duke and the Oudenarde victory.
Ah, okay.
So that in itself is quite an exciting thing. We find out that there's jewellery, we find out when it was bought, we find out how much it cost. But perhaps of greater significance is that Sarah and Queen Anne had a huge falling out at this point on this day, because Sarah was forced to accompany Queen Anne in an open carriage, and as groom of the stole, she had laid out jewels for the Duchess, for the Queen to wear. But when she got into the carriage with Queen Anne, she found out that the Queen wasn't wearing any of the jewels that she had laid out, which meant that Sarah felt very undermined, and she was very concerned about court gossip, that the things that she had prepared hadn't been worn. The argument escalated between the two to the extent that Sarah was actually overheard telling the Queen to be quiet, which is not a particularly sensible move by any stretch of the imagination. And Anne never actually forgives Sarah for that. So to find in writing that there were jewels that were bought, that were accounted for, is fits into the story that we knew about the argument. So whilst on the one hand I don't know why the mad Spaniard was paid, I knew that there was an argument over jewels because I'd heard about it, but this is proof that incident had actually that there were purchase of jewels behind it.
You see, you should never throw anything away, should you? You know, you should keep all your diaries, all your bills, etc.
Exactly. Hoarding.
Always. Yeah. So shall we move on to another favourite item?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So tell me what you see here.
So this is a map, a survey of the land of Woodstock and the immediate towns around it that was done in 1772. So that was during the fourth Duke's time by a gentleman called Thomas Pride. And he was an estate surveyor based in Bloomsbury in London, and we do have a number of his plans of areas surrounding Oxfordshire that the fourth Duke had commissioned him to do. Unfortunately, the other items that we have are not in as sound a condition as this, which is why I've chosen this one. And if you look at the colour, it is so vibrant and so clear and so distinct, despite its age. And I think if we can look closely at the area around the palace. So here, we've just honed closely in on what the map shows of Blenheim. And we learn from it that this was actually done post Capability Brown. So after his work had been carried out and the changes had been made around the estate. So we can see the belt of trees around the park, around the edge. There's a double row of trees there. And then we've got the Grand Avenue. So we've got trees from the palace stretching from the palace all the way up to Ditchley Gate in the north and to Kensington Gate in the east. Yeah. We can see the South Lawn which was that replaced Henry Wise's Grand Parterre, which was built for the first Duke. This is quite a controversial move by Brown, because that had Henry Wise, during the first Duke's time, had produced these formal gardens of box yew trees and holly hedges, and they were symmetrical, and there was a raised walkway, and there were different colours of gravel and sand, and this was all replaced with a large lawn. So there have been some critics of Capability Brown for that decision. But the flip side of it is there's also evidence that it wasn't in the greatest state of repair at the time when these changes were made.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing that we can see that is different to now is the Great Court, because that was actually lawned, and because Capability Brown felt the original design of the cobbles and gravels was too formal, so laid grass throughout it, and it remained that way until the 9th Duke decided to return it to the cobbles as we have today in the early 1900s. And then, of course, as where we can see now, we've got the lake and the changes with the cascades. Now, this map was produced 3 years before the cascades were finally finished. So
it is extra, as you say, it's so vivid, and the detail, because I think we take it a little bit for granted that, you know, we can go up in an aeroplane and look down.
Absolutely.
Whereas, you know, he was doing it from ground level as well. It's just absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary feat, and then just the level of detail, and we're just so incredibly fortunate that it's surviving today in the condition that it is. And you know, I like the story that it tells, and that we can still see in great detail that that's how it was at the time. They're my favourite things.
Excellent. I feel you should burst into song now.
Yeah, exactly.
No, that's
Run up into the hills.
Alexa, we've had well, there are some more questions I'd quickly like to ask, because time is marching on, unfortunately. Yes. So you mentioned how you came into the job, and you've mentioned the sorts of changes that you've seen. So what have you got planned for the future? Because I can't help but think that it's not going to just stay as it is for the time being.
No, it's all changed, and that's kind of the ironic thing. You're looking at very old material, but it's how to keep it alive, so how we preserve it. And my role is kind of, it's almost threefold. At the one hand, my responsibility is to protect the family and the palace's integrity, and to preserve the material, but also to make it available to researchers at appropriate times to support keeping history alive. And the ways that we can balance the need to access the material for research purposes is to move towards digitization, so that we're not bringing out the same piece of paper over and over and risk damage and break to it. So that's one area that we're developing, and we want to bring the information that we've got so safely guarded in these boxes to just sort of bring it to life, to make the visitors excited when they can come round. Whilst they can't touch certain letters, they can actually see them. They can have a close virtual experience while they're on site, at the same time as preserving the originals. And I work closely with Oxford University in providing formal internships to give students opportunities to have time working in an archive environment. And then just generally making material more available at appropriate times, with the caveat that sometimes things can't be accessed because they're just too fragile. And it's not worth the risk of material to explore more as to what it is.
Alexa, so how frequently do you add, or sorry, again, over the past 5 or 6 years, do the archives continue to grow? I mean, not just because time's passing and so, you know, things get added in that way, but have things come into the collection? Or, you know, what happens? Or do you just say, no, I haven't got enough room now, enough?
I ask for more space. I do receive material on a regular basis of various sizes. Often, there have been instances when areas of the palace are being tidied or reorganised, then certain things are found and they come to me, or they are moved from parts of the palace to the conditions which are more suited for the material in the archives. We accept donations of Blenheim related and Spencer Churchill family related items.
Do you ever turn things away, Alexa? Sorry. So if I were to come to you and say, look, I have this lovely teacup that has Blenheim on it, please have it for your archive, what would be your response?
I would say thank you very much for considering us. I don't tend to take artifacts as such. It is predominantly paper based, and I don't tend to take items which are available elsewhere. So for example, newspapers can be sought from many different places, and this is a common collection policy that archives tend to have, is that they won't take duplicate material. And I'm also very cautious about taking material that needs special equipment to read it. So when we're looking at things like floppy disks and CDs, they incur a large cost to reformat. So the material that I've got to date, we're going through the process of taking it off the CD, off the floppy disk, into a digital format that is going to survive longer. So I'd be reluctant to take those sort of things in the future.
On that note, you know, you've shown us, for example, Queen Anne's account book. Now, in 50, 100 years' time, what is there going to be for people to look at? You know, because we'll delete our emails, we don't print things off in the same way. You know, can you see a future where...
I mean, this is a huge responsibility that I have, and we all have collectively. It's capturing the modern archives, or what is happening today, and that's one of the projects we're working on at the moment to work out how we can preserve those emails, how we can keep things electronically, how some things can be printed off but not everything, and sorting through it. So as you said before, never throw anything out. We can't keep everything in the paper format, but there are alternative ways to keep it, and that's an avenue that we're very keen on exploring as we speak.
But I think my worry is that there just won't be, you know, for example, you and I communicate by email, you know, so in years to come, that email won't exist. You know, so all these lovely little tidbits about mad Spaniards and, you know, jewels and things just won't be there. And that saddens me.
It is sad, and it's something that the whole profession is a problem that we're all facing, and trying to grapple with how to keep things. But it's sort of moving with the times about how people access things. So whilst the Queen Anne book, of course, it's beautiful, it's one of my favourite items. If in 300 years' time we have worked out a way to capture payments today of, for example, the charity work that the palace supports in the local community, you wouldn't be able to come in, not so many people would be able to come in and see that. But if you've caught it electronically, if you've caught it in the way that is more universally accessible, there is benefit in that people can understand more and see what has happened in a way that you're restricted as to how many people can actually see Queen Anne's account book. So it swings and roundabouts. There are good and bad things.
Always. Another question.
Yeah.
What are you asked most frequently? Because I know that, you know, your inbox is often full of requests from people. What do they ask you? What's the most common thing you get asked?
I think the most common thing people ask me are family history research questions. Did my grandmother work here? Or I think my grandmother worked here. Do you have a record? Do you have a photograph? And they're actually the hardest questions to answer, because we don't have HR records for the first Duchess's time in the same way that we have now. 300 years time, we can tell you that I worked here, that you worked here, and that sort of thing. We don't have those, and the way that the information that we've got very thick old ledgers, and they're account books. And what would happen would be a lump sum of money would be given. So you would have an entry for the butler. The butler would get a certain amount, but then the butler would have his own account books detailing who he was paying and how much. And unfortunately, we don't have that. So if, for example, you were doing a special project or doing a bit of overtime, you might appear in the ledger in the overall account book, but it wouldn't give you an indication that that person continuously worked through the palace. So I'm restricted, unfortunately, on what evidence I can provide to families to show that their ancestors worked with us.
Right, okay. So, oops, sorry. And I always remember there being a thing about, did my granny work there? And the number of head gardeners we've had is legendary, I believe.
It is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. So I haven't quite worked out whether they didn't stay very long or whether there were teams of them. But yes, there are a lot.
And Alexa, one more question. Is there anything that you would like, that you're aware of, that used to be in the collection, you know, going back as far as the first Duke, that you would really love to see back? Because I know that there was, you know, we have talked about reuniting the collection. Is there any particular item that you would see back if you could?
Wow, I think I would probably go for the first Duke and Duchess's letters, their personal letters when they wrote when they were apart, particularly during the time that Sarah was here in the UK watching the build of the palace, and His Grace was overseas during military campaigns. That would be my wish list.
Right. Well, I think on that note, I just want to say thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have an insight into the archives, into the work you do, and into how you look after, you know, this amazing collection. You know, it's a fantastic job that you do.
Yes, I'm very happy.
So thank you very much. And to those of you that have been able to join us this evening, thank you too. And next week, same time, same place, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about Blenheim at Christmas and what used to go on at Blenheim to celebrate Christmas, what goes on now, and who knows what will go on in the future. But thank you so very much, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.